The sound of a pen scratching across paper had become the soundtrack of Rachel Casey's broken heart. $10 million. That was the price of her husband's latest betrayal, written in Stephen Hendry's precise handwriting across the cream-colored check that lay between them on his mahogany desk. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Beverly Hills mansion, the city sparkled like scattered diamonds. But inside this oak-paneled study, the air felt heavy with unspoken pain. "There," Stephen said, sliding the check across the polished surface with the casual indifference of a man paying for groceries. "Same as always, Rachel." Clean and simple. Rachel's fingers trembled, not from greed, as Stephen assumed, but from the weight of what this money represented. $70 million over 5 years, 7 checks, 7 betrayals, 7 times her heart had shattered while she smiled and accepted his twisted version of accountability. She was 32 years old, though the lines around her dark eyes made her look older. Stephen was 35, still handsome in that sharp-suited way that had first caught her attention at a charity gala 7 years ago. Back then, she'd been a young teacher volunteering at the event, and he'd been the youngest billionaire in tech, having built his empire from a dorm room coding project that revolutionized cloud computing. "You know," Stephen continued, leaning back in his leather chair that cost more than most people's cars, "I was talking to Harrison at the club yesterday. His wife threw a vase at his head when she found out about his secretary. Drew blood and everything." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Thank God you're more reasonable than that." Reasonable. The word stung like a slap. If only he knew that reasonable meant Rachel had spent every sleepless night for 5 years crying into her pillow, then waking up to teach second graders how to read while her own life fell apart, letter by letter. "Most women would have left by now," Stephen added, studying Rachel's face with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen, "or at least demanded I stop. But you understand how the world works, don't you? Everyone has their price." Rachel looked up from the check, meeting his gaze with those luminous brown eyes that had once sparkled with dreams of growing old together, of children running through their garden, of lazy Sunday mornings reading the newspaper in bed. Now those eyes held secrets Stephen couldn't begin to imagine. "Everyone has their price," she repeated softly, her voice carrying an undertone he was too self-absorbed to catch. "You're absolutely right about that, Stephen." But Rachel wasn't thinking about money at all. She was thinking about little Maria at St. Catherine's Orphanage, whose heart surgery would be paid for with this check. She was thinking about 12-year-old David, who'd been aging out of the system until Rachel's anonymous donations built a transition home. She was thinking about the 53 children who called her Angel Rachel every weekend when she visited, bringing not just financial support, but something more precious, unconditional love. Stephen had no idea that his wife disappeared every Saturday and Sunday, telling him she was visiting her sick aunt in Pasadena. He had no idea that she'd spent the last 5 years creating a secret family with dozens of orphaned children who'd been abandoned by the world. He had no idea that every dollar of his guilt money had gone toward buying formula for babies, school supplies for teenagers, Christmas presents for children who'd never known the magic of waking up to gifts under a tree. "I should get going," Rachel said, folding the check with the same careful precision she used when grading her students' papers. "I have lesson plans to finish for Monday." Stephen glanced at his Rolex, a limited edition worth more than most people's annual salaries. "It's Friday night, Rachel. Don't you think you work too hard? Those kids will be fine without perfect lesson plans for one weekend." If only he knew how wrong he was. Those kids, her students at Roosevelt Elementary, were the light that kept her going through the darkness of their marriage. Teaching wasn't just her job, it was her sanctuary. Every morning she walked into her classroom and was greeted by 28 bright faces that looked at her like she hung the moon. They had no idea their beloved Miss Casey went home each night to a husband who treated their wedding vows like a business contract with penalty clauses. "Children deserve our very best," Rachel replied, standing gracefully, despite the exhaustion that seemed permanently etched into her bones. At 5'6", she still carried herself with the poise that had made Stephen fall in love with her, though he'd forgotten that somewhere along the way. "I'll be in my studio if you need anything." Her art studio was the one room in their 12,000-square-foot mansion that Stephen never entered. He claimed it smelled too much like paint and turpentine, but the truth was simpler. Rachel's art made him uncomfortable. Her paintings were full of children's faces, bright with hope and innocence, and something about those eyes reminded him of things he'd rather not think about. As Rachel walked toward the door, her phone buzzed. Stephen caught a glimpse of her face as she read the message, and for just a moment, her features transformed. The tired lines around her eyes softened, and a genuine smile, the first he'd seen in months, spread across her face. "Good news?" he asked, more out of habit than genuine interest. "Just a friend," Rachel said quickly, tucking the phone away. But Stephen had seen enough to notice how her whole body seemed to come alive. When was the last time she'd smiled at him like that? When was the last time she'd smiled at him at all? The message had been from Mrs. Patterson, the director of St. Catherine's Orphanage. "Angel Rachel, little Tommy took his first steps today. He was reaching for the teddy bear you brought him. Wish you could have seen it. The children are asking when you'll visit again. Friday can't come soon enough." Rachel's heart swelled with joy and pain in equal measure. Friday meant tomorrow, and tomorrow meant 12 hours of pure happiness with the children who loved her unconditionally. But it also meant maintaining the elaborate lie that had become her life, telling Stephen she was visiting her aunt while actually building the family she'd always dreamed of with children who needed her as much as she needed them. "Have a good evening," she said to Stephen, her voice carefully neutral. Stephen barely looked up from his phone, already scrolling through messages from Natalie about their weekend plans. "You too. Don't wait up. I'll be working late." Working late. It was his favorite euphemism, and they both knew exactly what kind of work he'd be doing. Rachel had stopped asking questions about his late nights years ago, right around the time she'd stopped believing his promises that each affair would be the last. As the study door closed behind her with a soft click, Stephen felt a strange moment of something. Regret? Guilt? He couldn't quite name it. But the feeling passed quickly, buried under layers of justification and entitlement that had built up over 5 years of getting away with everything. In her studio, surrounded by paintings of laughing children and sunny meadows, Rachel sat at her easel and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through dozens of photos from her last visit to the orphanage. Emma building blocks, little James learning to tie his shoes, the teenagers working on their homework at the study table she'd funded. These children had become her everything. They called her Angel Rachel, and in their presence, she felt like she could fly. They didn't know she was married to a billionaire. They didn't know about the checks or the betrayals or the way her heart broke a little more each month. To them, she was simply the lady who showed up every weekend with hugs, stories, and an endless supply of love. Rachel opened her laptop and began typing an email to Mrs. Patterson. "Please prepare the list for this month's needs. I'll have the donation ready by Monday. Also, has the new playground equipment been installed? I can't wait to see the children's faces when they see it." As she typed, tears fell silently onto the keyboard. In 6 hours, she'd be surrounded by 53 children who thought she was an angel. If only they knew she was just a woman whose own husband thought so little of her that he could buy forgiveness with a check. But tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow, she'd hold babies who giggled when she sang lullabies. Tomorrow, she'd help teenagers with their college applications, telling them they could be anything they dreamed of becoming. Tomorrow, she'd be the mother she'd always wanted to be, even if it was borrowed time with borrowed children. Stephen's voice drifted down the hallway as he talked on the phone, probably making plans with Natalie. Rachel closed her eyes and made a decision that would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. This would be the last check she'd ever accept, the last time she'd let Stephen's money buy her silence. The last Friday she'd lie about visiting her aunt, because even angels have their breaking point, and Rachel Casey had finally found hers. What Rachel doesn't know, Stephen's business partner has been watching Natalie, and what he's discovered will change everything. Chapter 2. The Marriage Foundation and Hidden Secrets. 5 years ago, Rachel Casey had believed in fairy tales, until the day she found lipstick on her husband's collar that wasn't her shade of red. The memory hit her like a physical blow as she sat in her car outside St. Catherine's orphanage the next morning, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She'd been Mrs. Stephen Hendry for exactly 6 months when she'd made that devastating discovery, standing in their walk-in closet, holding his shirt like evidence of a crime. She could still remember every detail of that night, how Stephen had come home from his business dinner with cologne that smelled like vanilla and sin, how he'd kissed her forehead with lips that tasted like lies, how she'd waited until he fell asleep before crying silently in the bathroom until dawn. The confrontation the next morning had been excruciating. Stephen, caught red-handed with text messages from his assistant Jennifer sprawled across his phone screen, had done something that still took Rachel's breath away with its coldness. He'd opened his checkbook. 10 million, he'd said, his voice steady as granite. I messed up and I'm sorry. This should cover the pain and inconvenience. Rachel had stared at the check like it was written in blood. She was 28 years old, 18 months into what she'd thought was a perfect marriage. You think money can fix this? Rachel, be realistic, Stephen had replied, already adjusting his tie for another day of building his empire. He was 31 then, still riding the high of his company's IPO success. We both knew what we were getting into when we married. I'm a powerful man with opportunities. This way, everyone wins. You get financial security, and I get honesty instead of hysterics. The worst part hadn't been his arrogance. It had been the way he'd made her feel naive for expecting fidelity. Like she was the foolish one for believing in love, for thinking their wedding vows meant something sacred. But then, baby Emily at St. Catherine's had gotten pneumonia. Rachel had been volunteering at the orphanage since college, reading to the children every weekend as part of her teacher training program. When she'd learned that Emily, sweet 6-month-old Emily, who'd been found on the orphanage steps, needed expensive medical treatment that their limited budget couldn't cover, Rachel had made a choice that would define the next 5 years of her life. She'd deposited Stephen's guilt money into the orphanage's account. $10 million had saved not just Emily's life, but 17 other children who desperately needed surgeries, therapy, and medical care. It had funded new cribs, hired additional nurses, and transformed the orphanage's medical wing into something that actually gave these abandoned babies a fighting chance. Angel Rachel! The sound of children's voices snapped her back to the present as she stepped out of her modest Honda, a car she'd kept despite Stephen's insistence that she drive something more appropriate for a billionaire's wife. 53 children lived at St. Catherine's, ranging from tiny infants to teenagers on the verge of adulthood. To them, Rachel wasn't Mrs. Stephen Hendry, tech billionaire's wife. She was simply the lady who showed up every weekend with armfuls of books, art supplies, and a love so pure it could heal the deepest wounds. Miss Rachel, Miss Rachel. 8-year-old Emma came running, her dark curls bouncing as she launched herself into Rachel's arms. Emma had been at the orphanage since she was 3, her parents lost in a car accident that had left her with no family in the world, except for the family she'd found here. "Good morning, my sunshine," Rachel whispered, breathing in the scent of Emma's strawberry shampoo. This was what love felt like, Not complicated or conditional, but simple and pure as spring water. Mrs. Patterson, the orphanage director, approached with a knowing smile. She was 68 years old and had been running St. Catherine's for 30 years, long enough to recognize something special when she saw it. "Our angel arrives just in time," Mrs. Patterson said warmly. "The children have been asking about you all week, especially since you missed last weekend." Rachel's cheeks flushed with guilt. She'd missed last weekend because Stephen had insisted they attend his company's annual gala, 5 hours of watching him charm investors and potential business partners, while Natalie Dunn hovered at his elbow like a beautiful vulture. "I'm sorry," Rachel said genuinely. "I promise I'll make it up to everyone today." "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Patterson laughed. "You don't owe us anything. You've already given us everything." If only she knew how literally true that was. Over the past 5 years, Rachel had donated every penny of Stephen's guilt payments to St. Catherine's. $70 million had transformed the place from a struggling institution into a model facility that other orphanages studied and admired. New dormitories with cheerful yellow walls and comfortable beds. A state-of-the-art kitchen that served nutritious meals instead of processed food, a library filled with thousands of books, art rooms, music rooms, computer labs, and a playground that looked like something from a fairy tale. But more than the buildings and equipment, Rachel had given something invaluable: her heart. She knew every child's name, their favorite colors, their dreams and fears. She'd held them through nightmares, celebrated their achievements, and loved them with the fierce protectiveness of a mother bear. "Miss Rachel, look what I drew." 10-year-old Marcus came racing over, clutching a crayon drawing that showed a woman with long, dark hair surrounded by smiling children. At the top, in shaky letters, he'd written, "My Angel." Rachel's throat tightened with emotion. "It's beautiful, Marcus. Absolutely beautiful. It's you," he said proudly. "You and all of us. We're a family, right?" "The best family in the world," Rachel whispered, and meant every word. As the morning unfolded, Rachel threw herself into the organized chaos of weekend activities. She helped the toddlers with finger painting, read stories to the middle kids, and worked with the teenagers on their college essay drafts. Each child received her undivided attention, her unlimited patience, her boundless love. At lunch, as she sat surrounded by chattering children sharing their week's adventures, Rachel's phone buzzed with a text from Stephen. "Working late again tonight. Don't wait up. Working late." She knew exactly what that meant, and exactly who he'd be working with. Natalie Dunn, his new marketing consultant, was 25 years old, with platinum blonde hair and ambitions that sparkled as brightly as her diamond earrings. Rachel had met her at the company Christmas party 3 months ago and had seen immediately how Natalie looked at Stephen, like a hunter sizing up prey. But what Rachel didn't know was that Natalie's interest in Stephen went far beyond romance or even money. What she didn't know was that David Kim, Stephen's business partner and closest friend, had been watching Natalie very carefully for weeks. David had noticed things. Natalie asking too many questions about Stephen's private deals. Natalie taking photos of documents when she thought no one was looking. Natalie making phone calls in languages David recognized from his own shadowy past. Conversations that sounded very much like corporate espionage. As Rachel laughed with the children and helped them build elaborate castles from blocks, David was across town in his office, staring at surveillance photos that would change everything. Photos of Natalie meeting with representatives from Quantum Industries, Stephen's biggest competitor. Photos of money changing hands. Photos of USB drives being passed like secret weapons in an invisible war. "Stephen, my friend," David murmured to himself in his empty office, "you have no idea what kind of viper you've brought into your nest." Meanwhile, at St. Catherine's, Rachel was reading bedtime stories to the youngest children, her voice soft and melodic as she brought magical worlds to life. She had no idea that in just a few months, this perfect life she'd built in the shadows would collide with Stephen's world in ways that would test everything she believed about love, forgiveness, and the price of a human soul. As she tucked Emma into bed, the little girl grabbed her hand. "Miss Rachel, will you ever leave us?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that only abandoned children truly understand. "Never," Rachel whispered, kissing Emma's forehead. "I will never, ever leave you, I promise." It was a promise she meant with every fiber of her being, but promises, as Rachel would soon learn, were sometimes broken by forces beyond anyone's control. Outside in the parking lot, as Rachel walked to her car under the starlit sky, she had no idea that someone was watching her. Someone who'd been hired to follow Stephen's wife and discover what she did with her mysterious weekend disappearances. Someone who worked for Natalie Dunn, and tomorrow that someone would deliver a report that would set in motion the most devastating betrayal of Rachel's life, one that would finally push her beyond her breaking point and force her to choose between the family she'd built and the marriage that was slowly killing her soul. But what Rachel doesn't know is that Natalie has been planning something far more sinister than just stealing her husband, and Stephen's business empire is about to become collateral damage in a war he doesn't even know he's fighting. Chapter 3. The Final Betrayal. The photograph in Rachel's trembling hands showed her husband kissing another woman in the exact spot where he'd proposed to her 7 years ago, Malibu Point. Their sacred place. The cliff overlooking the Pacific, where Stephen had gotten down on one knee with tears in his eyes, promising her forever with a voice that shook with emotion. Rachel had been 25 then, a young teacher fresh out of graduate school. Stephen had been 28, already a tech prodigy, whose company was about to go public. Now that sacred ground was defiled, tainted by Stephen's arms wrapped around Natalie Dunn's waist as they posed for what looked like an engagement photo. The image had been delivered to Rachel's classroom that Friday afternoon by a messenger who'd simply said, "Someone thought you should know." Rachel's students had been dismissed an hour ago, their cheerful voices echoing down the hallway as they headed home for the weekend. She sat alone at her desk, surrounded by colorful alphabet charts and inspirational posters, staring at the photo that had just shattered what remained of her heart. This wasn't just another affair, this was desecration. Her phone buzzed with a text from Stephen. "Taking a client to dinner tonight. Business opportunity. Will be very late. Client." Rachel almost laughed, but the sound that came out was more like a sob. She'd stopped believing his lies years ago, but this level of disrespect was breathtaking even for him. He wasn't even trying to be creative with his excuses anymore. Another text appeared, this one from an unknown number. "Check the society pages of tomorrow's Herald. Your husband has something to celebrate." Rachel's blood turned to ice. With shaking fingers, she Googled the Los Angeles Herald's online preview of their weekend society section. There, in the Spotted Around Town column, was a photo that made her stomach drop to the floor. Tech mogul Stephen Hendry was seen at Jeffrey's Malibu with marketing consultant Natalie Dunn, sparking rumors of a major business partnership. The pair seemed quite cozy as they discussed what sources say could be a revolutionary new venture. Could this be the beginning of something big? But it wasn't the article that destroyed her, it was the accompanying photo. Stephen and Natalie weren't just dining, they were feeding each other dessert, their fingers intertwined, their faces glowing with the kind of intimacy that should have been sacred between husband and wife. And Natalie was wearing Rachel's necklace, the antique sapphire necklace that had belonged to Rachel's grandmother, given to her on her deathbed with the words, "This will protect your heart, my darling. Wear it always." The necklace Stephen had clasped around Rachel's neck on their wedding day, promising it would never leave her throat as long as they both lived. Rachel's hand flew to her bare neck. When had she last worn it? Last weekend, when Stephen had suggested she dress down for their dinner at home. He'd said the necklace looked too formal for a quiet evening together. She'd trusted him, taken it off, left it on her vanity. Now it was around another woman's throat, like a trophy of conquest. Rachel drove home in a daze, her mind struggling to process this new level of cruelty. Stephen had crossed every line, broken every boundary, but this felt different. This felt like he was actively trying to destroy her, not just betraying her. The mansion was empty when she arrived, just as she'd expected. Stephen's cars were gone, and the house felt cavernous and cold despite its opulent furnishings. Rachel walked through rooms that had once felt like home, but now seemed like a museum dedicated to broken dreams. In their bedroom, their marriage bed where she'd once felt safe and loved, Rachel found more evidence of Natalie's presence. A different perfume lingered in the air, long blonde hairs clung to Stephen's pillow. And on the nightstand, carelessly left behind, was a hotel key card from the Beverly Hills Peninsula with a note in Natalie's handwriting. Room 412, where dreams come true. Your future, N. Your future. Rachel sank onto the bed that had become a crime scene, the hotel key card cutting into her palm as she gripped it. 5 years of pain, humiliation, and betrayal crashed over her like a tsunami. But beneath the hurt was something new, a cold, crystalline clarity that cut through her emotions like a blade. She was done. Done pretending this was a marriage worth saving. Done accepting money as an apology for having her heart trampled. Done being treated like a business transaction in her own life. Rachel stood up and walked to her closet with purpose. She pulled out the simple black suitcase she'd taken on their honeymoon to Italy, back when Stephen had held her hand and promised her the world. Now she filled it with only the essentials, clothes that reminded her of who she'd been before Stephen, photos of her students and the orphanage children, and the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her family. She left behind everything Stephen had bought her, the designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, the first edition books he'd given her for birthdays. Without bothering to learn, she preferred mysteries to classics. Let Natalie have it all. She was welcome to the gilded cage. Rachel was finally escaping. At 9 o'clock that evening, Stephen's Maserati pulled into the circular driveway. Rachel heard his key in the lock, heard him calling her name with the casual assumption that she'd be waiting for him like she always was. Rachel, I'm home. Sorry I'm so late. The meeting ran longer than expected. She met him in the foyer, her suitcase at her feet, her spine straight as a sword. Stephen stopped short when he saw her, his face cycling through confusion, annoyance, and something that might have been fear. What's this about? He asked, gesturing at the suitcase with the same dismissive wave he might use to swat away a fly. Rachel reached into her purse and pulled out the photograph, the hotel key card, and a printout of the Herald article. She laid them on the marble console table between them like cards in a poker game where she held all the aces. Malibu Point, she said quietly. Our place. The place where you promised to love only me until death do us part. Stephen's face went pale as he recognized the photo. Rachel, I can explain. My grandmother's necklace, she continued, her voice growing stronger. Around her throat, in our bed, in a hotel room where she writes about being your future. It's not what you think, Stephen started, but his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Rachel opened her purse again and pulled out his latest check, $10 million made out to cash, just like always. She held it up between them, and for a moment, Stephen relaxed. Here was the familiar pattern. Here was his wife accepting payment for his sins, ready to move on like they always did. But instead of pocketing the check, Rachel did something that would haunt Stephen for the rest of his life. She tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the foyer like thunder. Stephen's jaw dropped as he watched the pieces flutter to the marble floor like fallen snow. Rachel, what are you doing? Have you lost your mind?" "I'm finding it," she replied, her voice calm as a lake before a storm. "For 5 years, I've let you pay for my dignity. For 5 years, I've let you treat our marriage like a business contract with penalty clauses. For 5 years, I've been your wife in name only, while you've made me complicit in my own destruction." "You're being ridiculous," Stephen snapped, his confusion turning to anger. "Pick up that check. This is how we handle things. This is how we've always handled things. Not anymore." Those 2 words carried the weight of 5 years of suppressed pain, swallowed pride, and silent tears. Rachel picked up her suitcase and walked toward the door, each step feeling like breaking free from chains she'd worn so long she'd forgotten what freedom felt like. "Where are you going?" Stephen demanded, following her. "Rachel, be reasonable. We can work this out. I'll write you a bigger check. 15 million. 20 exclamation mark. Rachel paused at the threshold of the home she'd thought would shelter their dreams forever. When she turned back to look at Stephen, her eyes held a finality that made his blood run cold. "Don't call me again," she said, her voice soft but absolute. "Don't meet me again." The door closed behind her with a gentle click that somehow sounded louder than any slam. Stephen stood alone in his marble foyer, surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt as cold as a tomb. Within minutes, he was dialing Natalie's number, his pride wounded and his ego demanding validation. "She finally showed her true colors," he told Natalie when she answered. "Greedy and unreasonable. Good riddance." But as Stephen drove toward Natalie's apartment, he couldn't shake the memory of Rachel's eyes. There had been no greed there, no calculation, no anger. Only a profound sadness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than disappointment. What Stephen didn't know was that Rachel wasn't driving to a hotel or a friend's house. She was driving to St. Catherine's Orphanage, where 53 children were waiting for their angel to tell them goodnight stories. Where love existed without conditions, without contracts, without the poison of betrayal. And what Stephen definitely didn't know was that his business partner David Kim had just received a phone call that would change everything. A call from someone who'd been investigating Natalie Dunn for months. Someone who'd discovered secrets that would make Stephen's Marshall problems look like a minor inconvenience. The real game was just beginning, and Stephen Hendry had no idea he was already losing. Chapter 4. Pride and Mistress. Stephen Hendry had always believed that replacing one woman with another was as simple as changing clothes, until he discovered that some women left stains that never washed out. Natalie Dunn's penthouse apartment in Century City was a monument to expensive taste and hollow beauty. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Los Angeles, while designer furniture in stark whites and silvers created an atmosphere that sparkled like diamonds but felt cold as winter. Stephen had moved in 3 days after Rachel's dramatic exit, bringing nothing but wounded pride and a desperate need to prove he didn't need his wife. "Darling, you're brooding again," Natalie purred, gliding across the marble floor in a silk robe that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. At 25, she possessed the kind of calculated beauty that stopped traffic and broke marriages. Platinum blonde hair that caught light like spun gold, emerald eyes that seemed to catalogue every expensive thing in a room, and a smile that promised everything while meaning nothing. Stephen stood at the windows, watching the city lights blur through his reflection. 3 days, and he still couldn't shake the image of Rachel tearing up his check. In 5 years of marriage, she'd never raised her voice, never thrown anything, never even slammed a door. Her quiet dignity had been as constant as sunrise, until it wasn't. "She'll be back," Stephen said, trying to convince himself more than Natalie. "Once she realizes what she's giving up, once reality hits her, she'll come crawling back." Natalie's laugh was like crystal breaking, beautiful and sharp. "Oh, sweetheart, you really think it's about the money, don't you?" Stephen turned, irritated by her tone. "Of course it's about money." "She stayed for 5 years, took every check I wrote. What else could it be?" Maybe she had her reasons, Natalie said, settling onto the white leather sofa with feline grace. Reasons that had nothing to do with wanting your fortune and everything to do with something else. The way she said it made Stephen's skin crawl, but his pride was too wounded to examine the feeling closely. Instead, he poured himself 3 fingers of scotch and tried to forget the way Rachel had looked at him in those final moments, not with anger or hatred, but with something far worse, disappointment. "Forget about her," Natalie continued, rising and moving toward Stephen with practiced seduction. "You deserve someone who appreciates what you can offer, someone sophisticated enough to play in your world." She pressed against him, her expensive perfume filling his senses with vanilla and promises that felt as artificial as everything else in her sterile apartment. But even as Stephen kissed her, even as he tried to lose himself in her perfect body and perfect face, he couldn't escape the memory of Rachel's gentle touch, the way she used to trace patterns on his chest while they talked about dreams that now seemed foolish and naive. Over the next 2 weeks, Stephen threw himself into life with Natalie with desperate intensity. He bought her jewelry that sparkled like captured starlight, took her to restaurants where reservations required social connections he'd spent years building, and paraded her at industry events where photographers captured their every move for society pages. Natalie was everything Rachel wasn't: flashy, demanding, openly ambitious about the lifestyle she wanted. She wore designer clothes like armor and treated every social gathering like a stage where she was the star. Where Rachel had been content with quiet evenings reading or painting, Natalie craved constant entertainment, constant admiration, constant proof of Stephen's devotion measured in dollars and public displays. "The Henderson acquisition is worth $200 million, Stephen told her over dinner at Spargo, desperate for her approval and attention. "Biggest deal in my company's history." Natalie's eyes lit up with the kind of interest she usually reserved for jewelry store windows. "How wonderful! You're so brilliant, Stephen. Tell me everything. I love hearing about successful, powerful men at work." Stephen basked in her attention, but something nagged at him. Rachel had never asked about his business deals, but when he'd shared his excitement about successes or his frustration with setbacks, she'd listened with genuine care. She'd asked thoughtful questions, offered encouragement, and celebrated his victories as if they were her own. Natalie's interest felt different, hungrier, more calculating, like she was cataloging information for future use. "You know what I love about you," Natalie said one evening as they returned from another expensive dinner, her hands already working on his shirt buttons. "You're not afraid to take what you want. You don't apologize for being successful, for having needs. Unlike some people who pretend money doesn't matter." "You mean Rachel," Stephen said, his jaw tightening at the mention of his estranged wife. "Poor little school teacher," Natalie cooed with mock sympathy. "Living in that tiny apartment now, probably crying herself to sleep every night. I heard she's working summer school just to pay her bills. How pathetic." Stephen frowned. "How do you know where she's living?" Natalie's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Los Angeles is a small town, darling. Word gets around, especially about the wives that powerful men cast aside. People love to gossip about fallen queens." That night, as they lay in Natalie's king-sized bed with its silk sheets that felt like ice against his skin, Stephen found himself staring at the ceiling and thinking about Rachel. Was she really struggling financially? The thought bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Whatever their problems, he'd never wanted her to suffer. "You're thinking about her again," Natalie said, her voice cutting through the darkness like a blade dipped in honey. "No, I'm not," Stephen lied. "You are, and it's pathetic," Natalie continued, rolling over to face him. Her beautiful face looked cruel in the moonlight streaming through the windows. "A woman who obviously never appreciated what she had, and you're still moon-eyed over her like some lovesick teenager." "I'm not. You are." Natalie's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath her perfect features. But here's what's going to happen, Stephen. You're going to forget about your martyred little wife and focus on what really matters. US, our future together. The life we're building, our future, our life. Stephen realized with growing unease that he'd never discussed any long-term plans with Natalie. Their relationship had been built on physical attraction and wounded pride, not love or shared dreams. Rachel had talked about their future constantly, children they might have, places they'd travel when he retired, the garden she wanted to plant behind their house. "What exactly do you see as our future?" Stephen asked carefully. Natalie's smile returned, predatory and confident. "Well, first we need to make our relationship official. I can't keep being your mistress forever. It's beneath both of us. Then there's the matter of making sure I'm secure in this relationship." Secure? Protected, Natalie clarified, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest that felt nothing like Rachel's gentle touch. "I've given up a lot to be with you, Stephen. I've turned down other opportunities, other men who were interested in me. I need to know that my investment in us will pay off." Investment. The word hit Stephen like cold water. Natalie was talking about their relationship like a business deal, calculating returns and minimizing risks. It was exactly how he'd treated his marriage to Rachel, and the parallel made him sick. "I see," Stephen said quietly. "I knew you'd understand," Natalie continued, apparently missing the chill in his voice. "You're a businessman. You know that everything worthwhile requires proper contracts and guarantees." Over the following days, Stephen began to see Natalie with clearer eyes. Her constant need for expensive gifts, her insistence on being photographed at high-profile events, her calculated responses to everything he said, it all added up to a picture he didn't like, but it was a conversation he overheard that finally opened his eyes completely. Natalie was on the phone in her bedroom, while Stephen waited in the living room, and her voice carried through the thin walls of the modern apartment. "Of course I'm playing the long game," she was saying to whoever was on the other end. "Stephen Hendry is worth $500 million. Do you think I'm going through all this just for fun? The man is completely clueless. He actually thinks I care about his boring business stories." Her laugh was like ice crackling. Rachel Casey was an idiot for walking away from all that money, but her stupidity is my opportunity. By Christmas, I'll have a ring on my finger and a prenup that guarantees me at least $50 million if this doesn't work out. It's just a matter of making him feel like he needs me more than he needs his precious memories of St. Rachel. Stephen felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Everything, every kiss, every smile, every declaration of affection had been an act. Natalie wasn't in love with him. She was in love with his bank account. The worst part wasn't her deception. The worst part was realizing that he'd done the same thing to Rachel, treated their relationship like a transaction, reduced love to a series of payments and penalties. But Rachel had never been calculating or cruel. She'd endured his betrayals with dignity, accepted his money without demands, and loved him despite everything he'd done wrong. And he'd thrown it all away for a woman who saw him as nothing more than a walking ATM. That evening, Stephen packed his bags while Natalie was at her yoga class. He left a note on her marble counter. "Don't call me again. Don't meet me again. Find another fool to fund your lifestyle." As he drove away from the penthouse, Stephen felt hollow but oddly cleansed. He'd traded his angel wife for a beautiful devil, and the devil had shown him exactly what he'd become, a man who thought everything could be bought and sold, including love. But as he pulled into the driveway of his empty mansion, Stephen had no idea that his real journey was just beginning. Because somewhere across town, Rachel was reading bedtime stories to children who loved her unconditionally, and soon he would discover that the woman he'd lost was worth more than all his money combined. Little did Stephen know that tomorrow would bring a phone call that would shatter everything he thought he knew about the woman who'd shared his bed for 5 years, and force him to confront the devastating truth about where his guilt money had really gone. Chapter 5. The Trap Tightens. Stephen Hendry returned to his empty mansion like a man walking back from his own funeral, alive but fundamentally changed by what he'd buried. The silence hit him first. After weeks of Natalie's constant chatter, demands, and calculated laughter, the quiet of his Beverly Hills home felt profound as a cathedral. Stephen stood in the marble foyer where Rachel had said her final words to him, and for the first time in months, he could think clearly. The house felt different without Rachel's presence, but it felt different without Natalie's intrusion too. Where Rachel's absence created a gentle melancholy, like a song played in a minor key, Natalie's departure left only relief and a growing sense of shame at how easily he'd been manipulated. Stephen walked through rooms that had once been filled with Rachel's laughter, her quiet humming as she graded papers at the kitchen table, her soft footsteps on the hardwood floors as she moved through their life together. Now those same rooms echoed with memories of what he'd thrown away for a woman who'd seen him as nothing more than a bank account with good looks. His phone had been buzzing incessantly since he'd left Natalie's apartment. 17 missed calls, 12 voicemails, and dozens of text messages that grew increasingly desperate and then increasingly angry as she realized he wasn't coming back. "Stephen, darling, where are you? I came home and found your note. Surely you don't mean it. This is ridiculous. Call me back right now. We need to talk about this like adults. You're making a huge mistake. I love you, Stephen. Don't throw away what we have. Fine. Run back to your pathetic memories of that frigid wife of yours. See how well that works out for you." Stephen deleted the messages without reading them all. Natalie's true colors were showing now that her meal ticket had walked away, and every word confirmed that his decision was right. But being right didn't fill the emptiness inside him. He poured himself a scotch and wandered into Rachel's art studio, a room he'd avoided since she'd left 3 weeks ago. The space still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume, and the paint she'd used to create worlds of joy he'd never bothered to understand. Her paintings lined the walls like windows into a soul he'd never taken time to explore. Children laughing in sunlit gardens, families holding hands beneath starry skies, scenes of pure happiness and love that seemed to glow with their own inner light. How had he lived with this woman for 5 years and never really seen her? Stephen's phone rang, startling him from his brooding. For a moment, his heart leaped with the impossible hope that it might be Rachel calling. Instead, the caller ID showed David Kim, his business partner and oldest friend. "You left Natalie," David said without preamble when Stephen answered. It wasn't a question. "How did you—" "Never mind, yes, I left her. It was a mistake from the beginning." "Good," David said with obvious relief. "I've been worried about you, Stephen. That woman was poison, and everyone could see it except you. Why didn't you say something?" David's laugh was rueful. "Would you have listened? You were so determined to prove you didn't need Rachel, so convinced that trading up was the answer to your problems. Sometimes people have to learn lessons the hard way." Stephen sank into Rachel's desk chair, surrounded by evidence of the woman he'd failed to appreciate. "I think I'm learning, but it might be too late." "It's never too late if you're finally ready to see the truth," David said gently. "Speaking of which, there's something I need to tell you." "About Rachel." Stephen's grip tightened on the phone. "What about her?" "I've been keeping an eye on her situation, making sure she's safe, that she's okay financially. I know you never asked me to, but I felt responsible somehow." "Responsible for what?" Stephen asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "For not trying harder to make you see what you had." David said quietly, "for watching you destroy the best thing in your life and not doing enough to stop you." Stephen closed his eyes, guilt washing over him like a tide. Even his friends had seen Rachel's worth more clearly than he had. Where is she living? Is she struggling? "That's what I need to talk to you about," David said, his voice careful. "Stephen, Rachel isn't struggling financially. In fact, she's never touched her personal savings, never used any of the credit cards linked to your accounts. She's been living off her teacher's salary and some kind of other income." Other income. "I don't know where it comes from," David admitted. "But Stephen, your wife has been donating massive amounts of money to charity. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions, going to various children's organizations and non-profits." Stephen felt like the world had tilted on its axis. "That's impossible. Rachel doesn't have that kind of money." "That's what I thought too. But the financial records don't lie. For the past 5 years, Rachel has been one of the most generous philanthropists in Los Angeles, and nobody knows where her funding comes from." The silence stretched between them as Stephen tried to process this information. Rachel had been giving away millions of dollars. Where had she gotten that kind of money? And then, like lightning striking in a clear sky, the answer hit him. "The checks," Stephen whispered. "What checks?" "The checks I wrote her, after every affair. $10 million, 7 times over 5 years. I assumed she was keeping them for herself." David was quiet for so long that Stephen wondered if the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with awe and something that sounded like grief. "Stephen, are you telling me that Rachel took your guilt money and gave it all away?" I don't know. Maybe. God, I never asked." $70 million, David said slowly. "If she donated all of it, Stephen, your wife has been one of the largest anonymous philanthropists in the city. Do you have any idea how many lives that could have changed?" Stephen felt sick. All these years he'd thought Rachel was greedy, materialistic, staying with him for the luxury and security his money provided. Instead, she'd been turning his betrayals into blessings for people who needed help. "I have to find out," Stephen said, his voice shaking. "I have to know what she did with that money." "Be careful," David warned. "If I'm right about this, if Rachel really has been giving away millions in your name, then you're going to have to face some hard truths about who she is versus who you thought she was." After David hung up, Stephen sat in Rachel's studio surrounded by her paintings of happy children and felt like he was drowning in his own ignorance. Had those children in her artwork been real? Had they been beneficiaries of the money he'd paid for her silence? He thought about all the times Rachel had disappeared on weekends, claiming to visit her sick aunt in Pasadena. He'd never questioned these trips, never offered to come along, never even asked about the aunt's condition. He'd been too busy planning his next betrayal, his next affair, his next payment for the privilege of destroying their marriage piece by piece. What if there had been no sick aunt? What if Rachel had been visiting children, helping families, using his guilt money to heal wounds he didn't even know existed? Stephen's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and began searching for information about children's charities in Los Angeles. Names blurred together: orphanages, hospitals, scholarship funds, meal programs. Any one of them could have been touched by Rachel's generosity, could have been saved by money he'd never bothered to track after writing the checks. As the hours passed and the sun set outside Rachel's studio windows, Stephen began to understand the magnitude of what he'd lost. Not just a wife, but a saint. Not just a woman, but someone who'd figured out how to transform pain into purpose, betrayal into blessing. And he'd let her walk away because he'd been too blind, too selfish, too convinced of his own narrative to see the truth that was right in front of him. Tomorrow, Stephen decided, he would start looking for answers. He would find out where Rachel had gone, what she'd done with his money, and who she really was beneath the surface he'd never bothered to explore. But tonight, Sitting in her empty studio surrounded by paintings of children who might owe their happiness to her secret generosity, Stephen Hendry finally began to understand what love really looked like. And it looked nothing like what he'd given her. As Stephen sat alone with his devastating realizations, he had no idea that Rachel was across town at an orphanage, reading bedtime stories to 53 children who called her Angel, children whose lives had been saved by the very money he'd thrown at her like pieces of silver, never knowing she was turning each coin into pure gold. Chapter 6. The Discovery. The mansion that had once been Stephen's palace now felt like a mausoleum, and he was about to discover that the woman he'd buried there had been an angel all along. 4 weeks had passed since Rachel had walked out of his life. 4 weeks since Stephen had ended things with Natalie and returned to the echoing emptiness of his Beverly Hills home. The house felt too quiet, too empty, too full of memories that cut like broken glass every time he tried to forget them. He'd been living like a ghost, haunting rooms that had once been filled with Rachel's gentle presence. Her coffee mug still sat in the kitchen sink, unwashed since the morning she'd left. Her books remained on the nightstand, bookmarks still holding her place in stories she'd never finish. Her absence lingered in every corner like a perfume that grew stronger instead of fading. The sleepless nights had become routine now. Stephen would lie in their bed, his bed now, staring at the ceiling and thinking about David's words. If Rachel really has been giving away millions in your name, then you're going to have to face some hard truths about who she is versus who you thought she was. The question had been eating at him for days, growing from a whisper to a roar that drowned out every other thought. Where had the money gone? What had Rachel done with $70 million over 5 years? And why had she continued driving her Honda, teaching at the same school, living as if the money meant nothing to her? Tonight, driven by insomnia and a desperate need for answers, Stephen had finally decided to stop wondering and start looking. Rachel's studio was exactly as she'd left it, paintbrushes still soaking in cloudy water, half-finished canvases propped against the walls, tubes of paint scattered across her work table like colorful evidence of interrupted dreams. Stephen had avoided this room for weeks, but now he forced himself to enter the space that had been Rachel's sanctuary. Every painting showed children. Children laughing, children playing, children reading books under sunny skies. Their faces glowed with innocence and happiness, and their eyes seemed to follow Stephen as he moved through the room like a trespasser in a sacred space. These weren't her students from Roosevelt Elementary. He'd met those children at school events. These were different children, younger and older, faces he'd never seen before. Who were they? And why had Rachel painted them with such loving detail? Stephen's hands shook as he approached Rachel's desk, a simple white piece she'd bought second-hand and painted herself. The drawers were unlocked, trusting in a way that made his chest ache with shame. Rachel had never hidden anything from him because she'd never had anything to hide. Or so he'd thought. The first drawer contained ordinary things, pens, art supplies, teaching materials. But in the second drawer, Stephen found a manila folder that made his breath catch in his throat. Inside were dozens of photographs, all featuring Rachel with children Stephen had never seen before. But these weren't casual snapshots. They were professional quality pictures, taken in a place that looked like a bright, cheerful facility with yellow walls and colorful murals. In every photo, Rachel glowed with a happiness Stephen had never seen on her face during their marriage. She was reading to toddlers, helping teenagers with homework, pushing little ones on swings, holding babies with the tenderness of a Madonna. The children looked at her with pure adoration, their faces shining with love that needed no payment, no conditions, no complicated contracts. At the bottom of the folder was a business card that made Stephen's legs give out. Saint. Catherine's Orphanage, where every child finds family, an orphanage. Rachel had been visiting an orphanage every weekend for 5 years, telling him she was caring for a sick aunt who'd never existed. With trembling hands, Stephen reached for the third drawer. Inside, he found a leather-bound journal with Rachel's name embossed in gold on the cover. Stephen had given it to her for their first anniversary, back when he'd still cared about thoughtful gifts and romantic gestures. He'd assumed she'd never used it. Rachel had never seemed like the diary-keeping type. He opened to the first entry, dated exactly 5 years ago. Stephen gave me a journal today. He said I should write down my thoughts, my dreams, the things that make me happy. I don't think he realizes that lately, the only things that make me truly happy are my students and my weekend visits to St. Catherine's. The children there have such beautiful souls. They love so freely, so completely, despite everything they've lost. Today, little Emma hugged me and said, "I smell like sunshine. I want to be someone's sunshine. I want to matter in a way that has nothing to do with money or status or being the right kind of wife." Stephen's throat tightened as he flipped through pages of entries that revealed a woman he'd never really known. Rachel had written about her students with the devotion of someone who saw teaching as a calling, not just a job. She'd written about the orphanage children with a tenderness that made Stephen's eyes burn with unshed tears. But it was an entry from 3.5 years ago that shattered his world completely. Stephen had another affair today. Jennifer from accounting. He gave me a check for $10 million, like my pain has a price tag. I wanted to throw it back at him, to scream that I'm not for sale, that our marriage isn't a business transaction. But then I thought about baby Michael at St. Catherine's, who needs heart surgery, and little Sophia, who's been waiting months for someone to sponsor her adoption paperwork, and the teenagers who dream of college but have no money for applications. Stephen's guilt money can become their hope. His betrayals can become their blessings. Maybe there's purpose in my suffering after all. The journal fell from Stephen's trembling hands. Every entry revealed the same devastating truth. Every penny of his guilt payments had gone to the orphanage. $70 million over 5 years, transformed from tokens of his shame into lifelines for children who had nothing. Emma asked me today why I sometimes look sad when I think no one is watching. I told her that angels cry sometimes too, but only because they love so much it hurts. She hugged me and said she'd protect me from whatever made me sad. A 7-year-old orphan wanting to protect me. I don't deserve these children's love, but I need it more than air. Stephen bought me diamond earrings today. His idea of an apology for missing our anniversary dinner. They cost more than most people make in a year. I smiled and thanked him, then sold them quietly and used the money to buy new playground equipment for St. Catherine's. Watching 50 children discover joy on swings and slides is worth more than any jewelry could ever be. I dream sometimes about what it would be like if Stephen knew about the children. Would he understand? Would he want to meet them, to see how his money, our pain, has been transformed into pure love? Or would he be angry that I turned his payments into charity instead of keeping them for myself? I'll never know, because I can never tell him. The children's safety and happiness matter more than my own heart. Page after page, year after year, the journal revealed a woman who'd taken Stephen's cruelest betrayals and alchemized them into gold, not for herself, but for children who'd been abandoned by everyone else in the world. The final entry was dated 1 week ago. Stephen's 8th betrayal feels different somehow, crueler. He took Natalie to Malibu Point, our sacred place, and gave her my grandmother's necklace. I think this is God's way of telling me I've suffered enough, given enough, endured enough. I've saved 53 children with Stephen's guilt money, given them hope and love and futures they never would have had otherwise. But I can't save myself if I stay. Tonight, I pray for the strength to finally choose my own happiness over their financial security. I pray the children will understand. I pray Stephen will realize what he's lost before it's too late. But mostly, I pray for the courage to finally say no to a man who thinks love can be bought and paid for like any other commodity. Stephen collapsed into Rachel's desk chair, his vision blurred by tears he hadn't shed since childhood. 53 children, 53 lives, saved with money he'd thrown at his wife like she was a prostitute accepting payment for services rendered. He'd thought Rachel was greedy, selfish, motivated by money. Instead, she was the most selfless person he'd ever known. A woman who'd endured 5 years of humiliation and heartbreak to save children who had no one else. With shaking fingers, Stephen pulled out his phone and called information. St. Catherine's orphanage, please. St. Catherine's, this is Mrs. Patterson speaking. How may I help you? I'm looking for Rachel Casey, Stephen said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I'm her husband. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Mrs. Patterson finally spoke, her voice was ice cold. Mr. Hendry, I presume? Yes. Is Rachel there? I need to speak with her. It's urgent. Rachel is here, Mrs. Patterson said carefully. She took a leave of absence from Roosevelt Elementary to volunteer here full-time. She's been living in our volunteer quarters, working with our children, finding peace in service to others. Please, Stephen begged, his pride crumbling like sand. Just tell her I found the journal. Tell her I know about the donations. Tell her I know what she did with the money. Another long silence. Then, Mr. Hendry, are you telling me that you gave your wife $70 million over 5 years and you never once wondered where it went? The question hit him like a physical blow. I thought she kept it. For herself. Mrs. Patterson's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Your wife, Mr. Hendry, is the most generous soul I've ever encountered. She's fed hungry children, provided medical care for sick babies, sent dozens of our kids to college, and given unconditional love to 53 little ones who'd been abandoned by the world. She's our guardian angel, and she's been breaking her own heart to save theirs. Can I see her? Can I talk to her? No, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. Rachel has asked that we not allow you on the property. She's building a new life here, Mr. Hendry, one where she's valued for her heart instead of her willingness to accept payment for pain. She's found her true family, children who love her unconditionally, who see her for the angel she truly is. Please, Stephen whispered. I know I don't deserve her forgiveness, but I need her to know that I understand now. I need her to know that I see who she really is. Mr. Hendry, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice softening slightly. Rachel spent 5 years trying to show you who she was. You weren't looking then. What makes you think you're capable of seeing her clearly now? The line went dead, leaving Stephen alone with the devastating truth of what he'd lost. Not just a wife, not just a marriage. He'd lost a saint who'd turned his sins into miracles, a woman who'd loved him so much she'd endured years of betrayal to save children he'd never even known existed. And now, surrounded by paintings of the children she'd rescued with his guilt money, Stephen Hendry finally understood what love really looked like. It looked like Rachel, giving away fortunes to save the innocent. It looked like sacrifice, selflessness, and a heart so pure it could transform poison into medicine. And it looked nothing like what he'd given her in return. But Stephen had no idea that across town, Rachel was tucking 53 children into bed, each one calling her Mama Angel, and that tomorrow one of those children would ask a question that would change everything he thought he knew about love, redemption, and whether some mistakes could ever truly be forgiven. Chapter 7. The Awakening and Broken Pride. The rain that fell on Beverly Hills that Saturday morning seemed to wash away the last of Stephen Hendry's illusions, leaving him naked and shivering in the truth of what he'd become. 5 weeks had passed since Rachel had walked out of his life. 5 weeks since Stephen had discovered the journal that revealed his wife's true heart. The leather-bound book now lived on his nightstand, its pages worn from countless readings, as Stephen tried to understand how he'd lived with an angel for 5 years without ever seeing her wings. The empty mansion felt different now, not just quiet, but sacred, like a cathedral where miracles had once happened and he'd been too blind to notice. Every room held new meaning as Stephen reread Rachel's journal entries and began to see their life together through her eyes. The kitchen, where she'd graded papers late into the night because she cared about every child's success. The living room, where she'd sat quietly while he talked about his business deals, offering gentle encouragement he'd mistaken for disinterest. The bedroom, where she'd held him after his nightmares about losing his company, never knowing that her own dreams were dying a little more each day. She was saving the world, Stephen whispered to his reflection in the bathroom mirror, and I was destroying ours. His phone buzzed with another call from his office. Patricia Wells, his CFO, had been trying to reach him for days about the quarterly reports, but Stephen couldn't bring himself to care about profit margins when he'd just discovered that his wife had been running a secret charity worth more than most corporations. Instead of answering, Stephen dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, clothes Rachel would have approved of, and drove to St. Catherine's Orphanage. He didn't go inside. Mrs. Patterson had made it clear he wasn't welcome, and Stephen respected Rachel's wishes even as they broke his heart. But he sat in his car across the street for hours, watching children play in a yard that his money, Rachel's sacrifice, had helped create. The playground equipment was beautiful, clearly expensive, designed to spark joy and imagination. Swings shaped like animals, slides that twisted like rainbows, climbing structures that looked like fairy tale castles. Stephen watched 53 children laugh and play, their voices carrying across the morning air like music from heaven. These were the faces from Rachel's paintings. These were the children she'd chosen over him, the family she'd built with his guilt money while he'd been too selfish to see what was happening in his own home. A little girl with dark curls caught his attention. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but she moved among the younger children like a protective older sister, helping toddlers onto swings and mediating disputes with the wisdom of someone much older. Stephen watched her for nearly an hour, fascinated by her natural leadership and gentle spirit. This had to be Emma. Rachel's journal had mentioned her dozens of times, always with special tenderness. Emma, who'd been abandoned at 3 years old. Emma, who called Rachel Angel and worried about her sadness. Emma, who'd wanted to protect the woman who'd been protecting all of them. As if she could feel his gaze, the little girl looked across the street, directly at Stephen's car. For a moment, their eyes met through the windshield, and Stephen felt like she could see straight through to his guilty soul. Then she smiled, not at him, but at someone behind him, and waved enthusiastically. Stephen turned to see what had captured her attention and felt his heart stop. Rachel was walking up the sidewalk toward the orphanage, her arms full of books and art supplies, her face glowing with the happiness Stephen had never been able to give her. She looked younger somehow, lighter, as if leaving him had lifted a weight she'd carried for years. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or expensive clothes. This was the beauty of purpose, of love freely given and joyfully received. This was the woman Stephen had married, the woman he'd slowly crushed under the weight of his betrayals until she'd finally found the strength to fly away. "Angel Rachel!" the children shouted, abandoning their games to run to her. She knelt on the sidewalk, not caring about her simple dress, and opened her arms to embrace as many of them as she could hold. Stephen watched through tears as Rachel was surrounded by 53 children, who loved her unconditionally. They fought gently for her attention, showing her drawings and sharing stories about their week, basking in the warmth of her smile like flowers turning toward the sun. This was what love looked like. Not transactions or contracts or guilt payments, but this pure joy, this mutual adoration, this family built on choice rather than obligation. Rachel stood and began walking toward the orphanage entrance, still surrounded by chattering children. For just a moment, she glanced across the street and saw Stephen's car. Their eyes met for the first time in 5 weeks, and Stephen felt his heart shatter all over again. There was no anger in her gaze, no hatred or bitterness. There was only a profound sadness, the same expression she'd worn the night she'd left him. She looked at him the way someone might look at a beautiful vase that had been irreparably broken, with grief for what had been lost, but acceptance that some things couldn't be fixed. Then she turned away and disappeared into the building with her children, leaving Stephen alone in his car with his regrets. That evening, Stephen sat in his study and did something he hadn't done since college. He wrote a letter by hand. Dear Rachel, I know you don't want to see me or speak to me, and I understand why. I know Mrs. Patterson won't let me on the property, and I respect that decision. But I need you to know that I found your journal, your photos, the truth about where my money really went. For 5 years, I thought you were taking my guilt payments because you were greedy, because you cared more about money than our marriage. I was wrong about everything. You weren't taking my money. You were transforming it. You turned my betrayals into blessings, my sins into salvation for children who needed miracles. I watched you today with the children. I saw how they love you, how you light up in their presence in a way you never did with me. I understand now that I didn't lose you to another man, or to pride, or to stubbornness. I lost you to love, real love, the kind that gives everything and asks for nothing in return. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve a second chance. I don't even deserve to know the details of the beautiful work you've been doing while I was destroying our marriage one affair at a time. But I need you to know that I see you now. I see your heart, your sacrifice, your incredible capacity for turning pain into purpose. You are the best person I've ever known, Rachel. You are everything I should have been, and everything I failed to become. Those children are lucky to have you, and I was the luckiest man in the world until I threw it all away. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking you to know that someone finally sees the angel you've always been. With all my love and deepest regret, Stephen. He sealed the letter in an envelope and addressed it to Rachel at St. Catherine's Orphanage. Then he sat in his empty house and began the hardest work of his life, learning to live with the knowledge of what he'd lost and what he'd never deserved in the first place. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean and carrying away the remnants of the man Stephen Hendry used to be. In his place sat someone smaller, humbler, broken by the truth but somehow more real than he'd ever been before. Tomorrow, he would find a way to help the orphanage without intruding on Rachel's new life. Tomorrow, he would figure out how to honor the incredible work she'd done with his money without expecting anything in return. Tomorrow, he would begin the long journey of becoming the man Rachel had once believed he could be, not for her, because he knew she was lost to him forever, but for the 53 children who called her Angel and deserved a world filled with people who understood what real love looked like. But tonight, Stephen Hendry sat alone with his regrets and his letter, finally understanding that the greatest love story of his life had been happening right under his nose, and he'd been too blind to see it until it was gone. Across town, Rachel was reading Stephen's letter by the light of her small bedside lamp, tears streaming down her face as she realized that sometimes the deepest pain comes not from being abandoned, but from finally being truly seen. Just a little too late. Chapter 8. the first crack in his heart. 6 weeks after losing his wife, Stephen Hendry stood at the gates of paradise and discovered that redemption sometimes comes through the eyes of a child. The letter had been delivered to St. Catherine's Orphanage on a Tuesday morning, carried by a courier who'd been instructed to wait for no response. Stephen had spent 3 sleepless nights crafting those words, pouring his heart onto paper in a way he'd never done during 5 years of marriage. He hadn't expected an answer. Rachel had made her position clear through Mrs. Patterson's icy rejections. But Thursday afternoon his phone had rung. Mr. Hendry. The voice was elderly, measured but no longer hostile. This is Mrs. Patterson from St. Catherine's. Stephen's hand had trembled as he'd gripped the phone. Yes? Rachel read your letter. She cried for a long time after reading it. Then she asked me to call you. She wants to see me. Hope had flared in Stephen's chest like a struck match. No, Mrs. Patterson had said gently, extinguishing that flame. She's not ready for that, and I'm not sure she ever will be. But she said something that surprised me. She said that if you truly want to understand what your money became, if you really want to see the miracles you helped create, then perhaps you should meet the children who call her Angel. Which was how Stephen found himself on Saturday morning, standing outside St. Catherine's Orphanage with his heart hammering against his ribs and his hands sweating despite the cool October air. He'd dressed carefully, simple khakis and a blue button-down shirt, nothing flashy or expensive. He wanted to look like someone who belonged here, though he suspected he never would. The building was more beautiful than he'd expected. Soft yellow walls, cheerful murals of rainbows and animals, windows that sparkled in the morning sun. Gardens bloomed with flowers tended by small hands, and playground equipment gleamed with the kind of care that spoke of love, not just maintenance. This was what $70 million looked like when it was spent with a pure heart, not a monument to wealth, but a sanctuary of hope. Mrs. Patterson met him at the front door. She was a woman in her late 60s, with silver hair and keen blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. She studied Stephen for a long moment, taking in his nervous posture and humble clothing. Mr. Hendry, she said simply. You came. I wasn't sure you'd really let me in, Stephen admitted, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Rachel asked me to give you a chance, Mrs. Patterson replied. Not for your sake, but for theirs. She gestured toward the sound of children's laughter echoing from somewhere inside the building. These children have experienced more abandonment and betrayal in their short lives than most adults face in decades. They need to see examples of adults who can change, who can grow, who can become better than they were. Stephen nodded, humbled by the weight of that responsibility. I'll try not to disappoint them. See that you don't, Mrs. Patterson said, but her tone had softened. Come. Let me show you what your wife built. The interior of the orphanage was like walking into a living rainbow. Artwork covered every wall, not professional pieces, but the glorious chaos of children's creativity. Hand-painted murals told stories of adventure and magic, while bulletin boards displayed poems, drawings, and school achievement certificates. Everything spoke of a place where children were encouraged to dream, to create, to believe in their own potential. We care for 53 children here, Mrs. Patterson explained as they walked down a hallway lined with photographs, ages ranging from 6 months to 17 years. Some are here temporarily while family situations are resolved. Others, like Emma, have made this their permanent home. Stephen paused at one of the photographs, a group picture of all the children with Rachel in the center, her face glowing with maternal love. Emma, he said quietly. I've read about her in Rachel's journal. Ah, yes, Emma. Mrs. Patterson's expression warmed. She's been here for 5 years, since she was 3. Her parents died in a car accident, and she had no other family. Rachel has been particularly close to her. Emma calls her Mama Angel, though she's careful not to do it when other children might feel left out. They entered a large, sunny room where about 20 children were engaged in various Saturday activities. Some were reading in cozy corners, others were working on art projects, and a few were playing board games at small tables. The moment Stephen appeared, conversation stopped and curious eyes turned his way. "Children," Mrs. Patterson called softly. "We have a visitor today. This is Mr. Stephen. He's someone very special to Miss Rachel." A little girl with dark curls and enormous brown eyes looked up from the book she'd been reading. Stephen recognized her immediately. This was Emma, the child he'd watched from his car, the little girl who'd captured so much of Rachel's heart. She studied Stephen with the serious intensity that children reserve for adults they're trying to figure out. "Are you Miss Rachel's husband?" Emma asked, with the directness that only 8-year-olds possess. The question hit Stephen like a physical blow. From the mouths of babes came the truth he'd been avoiding. Legally, he was still Rachel's husband, but in every way that mattered, he'd forfeited that title years ago. "Yes," Stephen said quietly, kneeling down to Emma's eye level. "I am. Or I was. It's complicated." Emma nodded sagely, as if complicated adult relationships were something she understood all too well. "Miss Rachel is sad sometimes. She tries to hide it, but I can tell. Are you why she's sad?" The honesty in her voice nearly broke Stephen's heart. Here was a child who'd been abandoned by the world, yet her first concern was for the woman who'd shown her love. "Yes," Stephen admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I hurt Miss Rachel very badly. I made mistakes that I can never fix." "What kind of mistakes?" Emma asked, settling cross-legged on the floor as if they were about to have a very important conversation. Stephen looked around and noticed that other children had gradually drawn closer, forming a loose circle around him and Emma. Their faces showed varying degrees of curiosity, wariness, and hope. These children had learned not to trust adults too quickly, but they were willing to listen. "I didn't appreciate Miss Rachel," Stephen said carefully, choosing his words for his young audience. "I took her love for granted and made choices that hurt her feelings. I wasn't a good husband to her." "Did you say you were sorry?" asked a boy who looked to be about 10, his arms crossed skeptically. "Many times," Stephen replied. "But saying sorry doesn't always fix things, especially when you keep making the same mistakes over and over." "Miss Rachel always says that real sorry means you change your behavior," Emma said wisely. "Did you change your behavior?" Stephen felt tears prick his eyes. Here was an 8-year-old orphan teaching him lessons about accountability that he'd failed to learn in 35 years of life. "No," he admitted, "I didn't change. And because I didn't change, Miss Rachel had to leave to protect her own heart." Emma nodded solemnly. "Sometimes people have to leave to stay safe." "I understand that." The simple acceptance in her voice made Stephen realize that these children understood abandonment in ways he never could. They'd all been left by someone, parents, relatives, circumstances beyond their control. But they'd found safety and love here, in this place that Rachel had helped build with his guilt money. "Miss Rachel talks about you sometimes," Emma continued, tilting her head like a curious bird. "She says you're very smart, and that you build important things with computers. But she says you forgot how to build the most important thing." "What's that?" Stephen asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Love," Emma said simply. "She says love is like a garden. You have to water it and take care of it every day or it dies. Did you forget to water your love garden?" Stephen's vision blurred with tears he couldn't hold back. "Yes, Emma. I forgot to water our love garden, and I let it die." "But gardens can grow again," Emma said with the eternal optimism of childhood. "You just have to plant new seeds and remember to water them this time." An older boy, perhaps 14, who'd been listening from across the room, stood up and walked over. "My name's Marcus," he said, extending his hand to Stephen with surprising maturity. "Miss Rachel helped me get into the gifted program at school. She said education was the key to breaking cycles." Stephen shook Marcus's hand, impressed by the teenager's poise. "That's wonderful. What do you want to study?" "Engineering," Marcus said proudly. "Miss Rachel says maybe someday I can build things that help people, like hospitals or schools. She says the world needs builders who care about making life better for others." More children began to approach, each one sharing something Rachel had done for them. Sarah, aged 12, talked about how Rachel had helped her overcome her fear of reading aloud. Little James, barely 6, showed Stephen a drawing Rachel had helped him make for Mother's Day, even though he had no mother to give it to. Teenager David spoke about college applications Rachel was helping him complete. Story after story painted a picture of a woman who saw potential in every child, who invested time and attention and hope in young lives that others had written off. Stephen began to understand that Rachel hadn't just donated his money to this place. She'd donated herself, becoming the mother figure these children had never had or had lost too soon. "Mr. Stephen," Emma said during a quiet moment, "can I ask you something important?" "Of course." "Do you love Miss Rachel?" The question was so direct, so innocent, yet so profound, that Stephen felt like his chest was cracking open. "Yes," he whispered. "I love her more than anything in the world, but I didn't know how to show it properly." "Then maybe you should learn," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Miss Rachel taught me how to tie my shoes when I was little. She taught Marcus how to do algebra. She taught Sarah how to be brave. Maybe she could teach you how to love better if you asked nicely." Stephen looked into Emma's wise 8-year-old eyes and saw something that took his breath away. Hope. Not naive optimism, but the hard-won hope of a child who'd survived loss and found family in unexpected places. These children believed in second chances because Rachel had given them second chances. They believed in redemption because they'd experienced it firsthand. "Emma," Stephen said softly, Would you teach me about Miss Rachel? Would you tell me what makes her happy, what makes her smile, what she needs to feel loved?" Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? You want to learn?" "More than anything," Stephen said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Well," Emma said, settling in as if she were about to share the secrets of the universe, "Miss Rachel loves it when we draw her pictures of our dreams. She keeps them all in a special box in her room. And she loves stories, not just reading them, but hearing about our days, our thoughts, our feelings. She says every person has a story worth telling." "What else?" Stephen asked, hanging on every word. "She loves flowers, but not fancy ones. She likes the ones we pick from the garden, even if they're just dandelions. She says beauty is about love, not money." Emma paused, studying Stephen's face. "Are you rich, Mr. Stephen?" "Yes," Stephen admitted. "Miss Rachel says being rich is only good if you use your money to help others. She says money is like water. If you keep it all in one place, it gets stagnant, but if you share it, it helps things grow." Stephen felt something fundamental shifting inside his chest, like a door that had been locked for years, suddenly swinging open. These children, these abandoned, forgotten children, were teaching him lessons about love and purpose that his expensive education and business success had never provided. "Emma," he said quietly, "would you mind if I came back next weekend? Would you teach me more about how to love better?" Emma beamed. "Yes. And maybe if you learn really well, Miss Rachel won't be sad anymore." As Stephen prepared to leave an hour later, Mrs. Patterson walked him to the door. "That was unexpected," she said quietly. "What was?" "Watching you with the children." You listened to them, really listened. You let an 8-year-old teach you things most adults would be too proud to learn. Stephen thought about Emma's wisdom, about the hope in Marcus's eyes, about the way these children had opened their hearts to a stranger simply because he belonged to someone they loved. "They're remarkable," he said. Rachel has built something incredible here." "She has," Mrs. Patterson agreed. "But Mr. Henry, I need you to understand something. These children have been disappointed by adults before. If you're going to be part of their lives, if you're going to let them care about you, then you need to be reliable. You need to be someone they can count on." Stephen met her gaze steadily. "I understand. And Mrs. Patterson, thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance I don't deserve." As Stephen drove home, Emma's words echoed in his mind. Maybe she could teach you how to love better if you asked nicely. For the first time in weeks, Stephen felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope exactly. That seemed too presumptuous after everything he'd destroyed. But it was possibility. The possibility that love wasn't a finite resource that could be used up, but a skill that could be learned, practiced, and improved. He had no idea if Rachel would ever forgive him. He had no idea if their marriage could be saved. But he knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to become the kind of man these children believed he could be. The kind of man who deserved to love an angel like Rachel Casey. That night, as Stephen sat in his empty mansion planning ways to help the orphanage, he had no idea that Rachel was across town tucking Emma into bed, and that the little girl was praying for something that would change all of their lives forever. Chapter 9. The Long Road to Redemption. 9 months after Rachel Casey had walked away from a billionaire's fortune, Stephen Hendry had learned that becoming worthy of love was the hardest work he'd ever done, and the only work that truly mattered. The November rain drummed against the windows of St. Catherine's Orphanage as Stephen sat cross-legged on the floor of the reading room, surrounded by 8 children between the ages of 4 and 7. In his hands was a worn copy of The Giving Tree, a book he'd never read as a child but had come to understand as an adult who'd spent his life taking instead of giving. "And the tree was happy," Stephen read, his voice soft and steady, "because she had given everything she could give." Little Tommy, a 6-year-old who'd arrived at the orphanage just 3 months ago, raised his hand. "Mr. Stephen, why did the tree give away all her branches and her trunk? Wasn't she sad to have nothing left?" Stephen looked into Tommy's earnest face and saw himself reflected there, a soul trying to understand the difference between love and loss, between sacrifice and foolishness. 9 months ago, he would have given a business answer, something about investment and returns. Now, he'd learned to speak a different language. "Sometimes, Tommy, when you love someone very much, making them happy is more important than keeping things for yourself." The tree wasn't sad because she knew her gifts had helped the little boy have a good life. "Like how Miss Rachel gave away her money to help us?" asked 6-year-old Lily, her pigtails bouncing as she nodded with understanding. Stephen's breath caught. Even the youngest children knew about Rachel's sacrifices. "Yes, exactly like that." "She must have loved us very, very much," Tommy said thoughtfully, "almost as much as she loved you." The simple truth in those words hit Stephen like a revelation. Rachel had loved him, really truly loved him, and instead of cherishing that gift, he'd treated it like something he was entitled to, something that would always be there no matter how badly he behaved. "More than I deserved," Stephen said quietly. Emma, still 8 years old but somehow wiser after 9 months of watching Stephen's transformation, looked up from her coloring book where she'd been creating a masterpiece of purple elephants and golden trees. "Mr. Stephen, do you remember what I told you about love gardens?" That you have to water them every day, or they die, Stephen recited, amazed at how clearly he remembered every conversation he'd had with these children over the past 9 months. Exactly, Emma beamed. And guess what? I think your love garden is growing again. Stephen followed her gaze to the window, where he could see Rachel in the orphanage's backyard garden, kneeling beside the vegetable beds they'd planted together last spring. She was teaching a group of older children how to harvest winter squash, her hands gentle as she showed them how to twist the stems without damaging the vines. For 9 months, Stephen had been coming to St. Catherine's every Saturday and Sunday, slowly earning the children's trust and Rachel's cautious acknowledgement. He'd started with simple tasks, reading stories, helping with homework, playing games that required patience he'd never possessed before. Gradually, Mrs. Patterson had allowed him to take on more responsibility. He'd learned to change diapers for the babies, discovered he had a talent for making the toddlers laugh during bath time, and found unexpected joy in helping the teenagers with their college application essays. Each child had taught him something different about love, that it was patient, from holding a crying infant until 3 a.m., that it was selfless, from giving up his weekend golf games to attend school plays, that it was consistent, from showing up every week no matter how tired or busy he felt. But the most important lessons had come from watching Rachel. She moved through the orphanage like sunlight made human, bringing warmth and joy to every corner she touched. Stephen had observed her from a respectful distance, learning the rhythm of her days, the way she made each child feel special and seen. She never played favorites, but somehow every child believed they were her favorite. She never raised her voice, but her quiet words carried more authority than any shout. She never promised what she couldn't deliver, but she delivered more than anyone could expect. Mr. Stephen, Marcus interrupted his thoughts. Are you going to help us with the Halloween decorations today? Marcus was 14 now, the boy Stephen had met on his first visit who'd wanted to study engineering. Over the months, Stephen had become his unofficial mentor, helping him with advanced math and physics, sharing stories about building his first company, encouraging the teenagers' dreams of changing the world through innovation. Of course, Stephen replied, standing and stretching muscles that had grown accustomed to sitting on floors and fitting into child-sized furniture. What did you have in mind? We want to build a haunted house in the basement, Marcus explained excitedly. Nothing scary for the little kids, just fun, spooky stuff. Mrs. Patterson said you might know about construction and electrical work. Stephen smiled, remembering his early days as an entrepreneur when he'd done everything himself, coding, wiring, building servers in his garage. I think I can help with that. As the morning progressed, Stephen found himself working alongside 12 children and 3 staff members to transform the orphanage basement into a magical Halloween wonderland. He installed safe lighting systems while the kids painted cardboard tombstones. He built simple mechanical contraptions that made skeleton arms wave, while Emma and her friends created ghost costumes from old sheets. The work was physical, messy, and completely different from the sterile boardrooms where he'd spent most of his adult life. His expensive khakis got paint on them. His hands grew calloused from hammering and sawing. His back ached from crawling around connecting wires and testing circuits. And he'd never been happier in his entire life. Mr. Stephen, Emma called from across the basement where she was hanging paper bats from the ceiling. Miss Rachel is watching you. Stephen looked up to see Rachel standing at the top of the basement stairs, a basket of sandwiches in her hands for the volunteer workers. She'd been watching him help install a fog machine while surrounded by laughing children, and her expression was unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met across the space filled with Halloween decorations and children's laughter. Stephen saw something in Rachel's gaze he hadn't seen in years, not anger or disappointment, but curiosity, as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time, recognizing someone new in the man she'd once known. Then she turned and disappeared back upstairs, But not before Stephen caught something that made his heart race, the faintest suggestion of a smile. "She's proud of you," Emma whispered, appearing at his elbow like a wise little ghost. "I can tell, because she gets that soft look in her eyes when she watches you play with us. It's the same look she gets when Marcus shows her his report cards or when baby Lucy takes her first steps." "How do you know?" Stephen asked. "Because I love Miss Rachel too," Emma said simply. "And when you love someone, you learn to read their face like a favorite book." That afternoon, as Stephen helped serve lunch to 53 children who'd begun to feel like his own family, he reflected on how much he'd changed over the past 9 months. The man who'd entered this building in shame and desperation barely resembled the person he'd become. Stephen had made the decision 3 months after Rachel left to step back from day-to-day operations of his company, promoting David Kim to CEO while he focused on what he'd finally realized mattered most. He still attended board meetings twice a week and handled major strategic decisions, but his real work now happened here, with children who taught him that success meant something entirely different than he'd ever imagined. Most importantly, he'd learned to love without expecting anything in return. These children gave him their trust, their laughter, their simple affection, not because he was wealthy or successful, but because he showed up, because he cared, because he'd proven week after week, month after month, that he wasn't going to abandon them. Mr. Stephen, Mrs. Patterson approached him as he helped clean up after lunch. "Might I have a word?" They stepped into her office, a cozy space filled with photos of children who'd grown up at St. Catherine's and moved on to successful lives. Stephen had learned that this orphanage had one of the highest success rates in the country. 95% of their children went on to college or trade programs, and over 80% maintained contact with the facility throughout their adult lives. "You've been coming here for 9 months, Mrs. Patterson began, settling behind her desk with the same warm authority she brought to everything. "You've never missed a weekend, never shown up late, never promised something you couldn't deliver." "The children deserve consistency," Stephen replied, echoing words Rachel had written in her journal. "They've been disappointed enough." "Indeed they have," Mrs. Patterson agreed, "which is why what I'm about to tell you is so significant. Stephen, the children have voted unanimously to ask you something very important." Stephen's heart raced. "What is it?" Mrs. Patterson smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it was a smile of genuine warmth rather than cautious politeness. "They want to know if you'd consider becoming an official volunteer. Not just weekend visits, but a real commitment. Background checks, training, the works. They want you to be part of their family officially." Stephen felt tears spring to his eyes. They want me to stay?" "Stephen, these children have seen more adults come and go than most see in a lifetime. They don't give their trust easily, and they don't ask people to stay unless they mean it. Emma has been talking about this for weeks, convinced that you're different now from the man who first walked through our doors." "I am different," Stephen said with quiet conviction. "This place, these children, they've changed me in ways I didn't know were possible." "I can see that," Mrs. Patterson replied, "but there's something else you should know. Rachel has been watching your transformation too. She sees how the children respond to you, how you've grown to genuinely care about them. It's affected her." Stephen's pulse quickened. "Affected her how?" "She's been asking questions. About your commitment here, about whether you're staying because you care about the children or because you're trying to win her back. She needs to know that your transformation is real, not just another strategy." "It's real," Stephen said without hesitation. "Mrs. Patterson, these children have given me something I didn't know I was missing. They've taught me what it means to love without conditions, to give without expecting returns. Even if Rachel never speaks to me again, even if she never forgives me, I want to be here for them." Mrs. Patterson studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you." And Stephen. Rachel is beginning to believe it too. As Stephen drove home that evening, his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Not because Rachel might forgive him, that was still an impossible dream, but because he'd found purpose in loving these children who'd been thrown away by the world. He'd spent 35 years building a fortune, but he'd never built anything as important as the relationships he was forming with 53 children who were teaching him how to be human. What Stephen didn't know was that Rachel had been standing at her bedroom window, watching him leave, and for the first time in 9 months, she'd whispered a prayer that had nothing to do with strength or protection, and everything to do with hope. Chapter 10. Love Reborn. 1 year after Rachel Casey had walked away from a billionaire's fortune, she discovered that the greatest treasure had been searching for her all along. Christmas Eve at St. Catherine's Orphanage glowed with magic that money couldn't buy. The building sparkled with warm light from every window, and children's laughter mixed with soft carols throughout the halls. 53 children had spent weeks preparing for their annual celebration, transforming their home into a wonderland of hope and joy. Rachel stood watching the controlled chaos, her heart full to bursting. This was her family, not born or married into, but chosen and built through love, sacrifice, and countless hours of devotion. "Miss Rachel," Emma's voice called from across the room, where she was directing younger children hanging ornaments on the 12-foot Christmas tree. At 9 years old, Emma had grown into the unofficial little mother of St. Catherine's, her gentle spirit making her beloved by all. She rushed over with something hidden behind her back, dark eyes dancing with excitement. "Close your eyes." Rachel obediently shut her eyes, smiling at their familiar game. "Okay, open them." Rachel opened her eyes to find Emma holding a handmade ornament, a simple wooden angel painted gold with dark hair and kind eyes that looked remarkably like Rachel herself. Around the angel's base, 53 tiny handprints in different colors formed a rainbow of love. "We all worked on it together," Emma explained proudly. "Even baby Grace helped with her handprint. It's you, Miss Rachel, our angel." Rachel's vision blurred with tears as she took the ornament in trembling hands. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. We wanted you to know that we'll always remember you saved us," said Marcus, now 15, and preparing for MIT thanks to Rachel's college prep program. "You gave us hope." "Miss Rachel," little Annie called urgently, "there's someone here to see you." "Someone important." "It's Mr. Stephen," Annie announced with earth-shaking gravity. "And he brought presents for everyone, and he's wearing a Santa suit." Rachel's heart stopped. Stephen was here? On Christmas Eve? Mrs. Patterson approached apologetically. "Rachel, Stephen asked to help with tonight's party. He's been working with our planning committee for weeks, and the children specifically requested him." "The children requested him." "Emma organized a petition," Mrs. Patterson explained fondly. "All 53 signatures. They consider Stephen family now, Rachel. He's earned that place through nearly a year of consistent love." Rachel felt her walls crumbling. For 12 months, she'd watched Stephen transform from the selfish man she'd married into someone who showed up every weekend without fail, who remembered every child's name and dreams, who'd learned to love without expecting anything in return. Before she could protest, Emma grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the main hall. What she found took her breath away. The hall had been transformed into a winter wonderland with twinkling lights and gentle artificial snow. Tables groaned under a feast fit for royalty. But it was Stephen in the center that made her knees weak, wearing a slightly too large Santa suit, surrounded by adoring children. He'd lost weight, his face leaner but more handsome for the character lines around his eyes. He looked nothing like the polished billionaire she'd married, and everything like the man she'd dreamed he could become. "Ho, ho, ho!" Stephen called in an exaggerated voice that made the youngest children giggle. "I heard there were very good children here who deserved special presents." "Mr. Stephen, you don't sound like Santa," protested 6-year-old Lily, laughing. "You're right," Stephen replied, dropping the act. "I'm not Santa. I'm just someone who loves you all very much and wanted your Christmas to be magical." Rachel watched Stephen distribute thoughtful gifts, books for readers, art supplies for creators, science kits for future engineers. But what he gave Emma made Rachel's tears spill over. From a velvet box, Stephen pulled out a delicate gold chain with a tiny angel pendant. "For the little girl who taught me how to love," he said quietly, fastening it around Emma's neck. "Thank you for showing me what it means to have a daughter." Emma burst into joyful tears, throwing her arms around Stephen's neck. "Does this mean you're staying forever? Does this mean you're really going to be our daddy?" Stephen's eyes found Rachel's across the room. "That depends on whether angels believe in second chances." The room went quiet except for soft Christmas music. Every child, every staff member watched the moment unfold between Stephen and Rachel. Rachel walked slowly across the room, her heart hammering. When she reached Stephen, still kneeling at Emma's level, she saw something in his eyes that took her breath away. Not desperate need, but pure, selfless love that asked for nothing and offered everything. "You learned," she whispered. "They taught me," Stephen replied, looking at the children who'd become his teachers. "Emma taught me that love needs daily care. Marcus taught me that building relationships matters more than building fortunes. These children taught me what real love looks like." "And what did I teach you?" Rachel asked. Stephen stood slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You taught me that real love means turning pain into purpose, that the strongest people choose kindness even when the world breaks their heart, and that some gifts are so precious that losing them changes you forever." "Stephen, I know I don't deserve forgiveness," Stephen continued, tears flowing down his cheeks. "But Rachel, these children have given me hope that maybe broken things can be repaired if you're willing to do the work." Emma tugged on Rachel's dress. "Miss Rachel, Mr. Stephen reads us stories every night, helps with homework, and even learned to braid hair. He's been practicing being a daddy for months and months." One by one, every child shared something Stephen had done for them, fixing toys, teaching skills, sitting through nightmares, showing consistent love and care. Rachel listened with growing amazement, watching Stephen receive their praise with humility and joy. This wasn't the man she'd married. This was someone new, forged by loss and purified by children's love. "Rachel," Stephen said quietly, "I have something that belongs to you." From his pocket, he pulled out her grandmother's sapphire necklace, the one he'd given to Natalie in his cruelest betrayal. "I bought it back," Stephen said simply, "because this represents your family's love, your heritage that I never should have given away. You deserve to have every piece of your heart returned." Rachel touched the necklace with shaking hands. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," he said, and she could see he meant it. "I want nothing from you, Rachel, but I want everything for you. I want you to be happy, to be loved the way you deserve. If that includes me, I'll spend my life proving I'm worthy. If it doesn't, I'll be grateful I learned what real love looks like by watching you love these children." Emma stepped between them, taking both their hands. "Why don't you both love each other and love us? We have room for lots of love here. Love gets bigger when more people join in." Rachel looked at Emma, then around at 53 children watching with hope, then back at Stephen's face. She saw a year of change there, a year of growth and learning and becoming. "1 year," she said quietly. "You've proven you can change for 1 year." But Stephen, these children need forever. They need parents who will never leave, never disappoint them. Forever, Stephen promised, his voice steady as stone. Rachel, I've learned the difference between wanting someone and loving them, between taking and giving, between making promises and keeping them. Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Trust. Trust that this man was capable of lasting love, enduring commitment, the faithfulness these children needed. "Then welcome home," she whispered, stepping into his arms. The children erupted in cheers. Emma started crying happy tears while Marcus chanted, "Family! Family!" Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes, and even the teenagers grinned from ear to ear. Stephen held Rachel like she was made of starlight, afraid she might disappear, but Rachel held him just as firmly, whispering words only he could hear. "You became the man I always believed you could be." "They taught me," Stephen replied, "but you were their first teacher. You showed them that love exists, that they're worthy of devotion." Emma tugged on their sleeves. "Does this mean we're going to be a real family?" Stephen and Rachel looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. The mansion suddenly seemed absurd. All that space for two people when 53 children needed a family home. "What would you think," Stephen asked Emma, "if Miss Rachel and I moved here permanently? If we became your live-in parents?" The children's response was immediate and overwhelming. Cheers, hugs, excited chatter about bedtime stories every night, and help with homework and someone to attend every school event. "We'll build whatever you need," Stephen promised. "Whatever it takes to give you everything you deserve." Mrs. Patterson approached with tears in her eyes. "Are you serious about making St. Catherine's your home?" "More serious than we've ever been about anything," Rachel replied, her hand finding Stephen's. As if on cue, baby Grace started crying from the nursery. Without thinking, both Stephen and Rachel moved toward the sound, their instincts synchronized. "We'll get her," Rachel said with a smile. "Together." They walked hand in hand, followed by children who wanted to witness every moment of this Christmas miracle. In the nursery, Stephen gently lifted 6-month-old Grace while Rachel prepared a bottle, their movements coordinated like a dance they'd been practicing their whole lives. "They're ours," Rachel said simply as they fed Grace together. "They always have been." Stephen understood that this was what happily ever after really looked like. Not a mansion filled with expensive things, but a room full of love given freely and multiplied infinitely. "I love you enough to put these children first," Stephen said quietly as Grace fell asleep in his arms. "To spend my life proving that some mistakes can become the greatest blessings." Rachel kissed him softly, tasting tears and hope and new beginnings. "I love the man you've become, the father you've learned to be." Emma clapped her hands together. "Best Christmas present ever. We have a mommy and a daddy, and they love each other and us. And we love you," Stephen and Rachel said in unison. Outside, snow began to fall on Los Angeles, a Christmas miracle for a family built on miracles, held together by love that had learned to forgive. The heart's true currency had never been money at all. It had been love, freely given and gratefully received. And finally, they were rich beyond measure. The end.